I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening for our Asia Symposium presentation with Dr. Russell Jeung. I want to thank the various committees and organizations at the college that have helped make this presentation possible. We've collaborated with the Center for Student Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with David Swope. I want to thank Field and Experiential Learning, Study Abroad, and the Global Education Program at CD for funding this presentation and for their support. After the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session with questions posted by our viewers and fielded by members of the Asia Committee. I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Russell Jeung. Dr. Jeung is a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University, the home of ethnic studies in the United States. Dr. Jeung is the author of books and articles on race and religion, including Family Sacrifices, the worldviews and ethics of Chinese Americans, Mountain Movers, Student Activism and the Emergence of Asian American Studies, and At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among My Ancestors and Refugee Neighbors. In March of 2020, Dr. Jeung co-founded Stop AAPI Hate with Chinese for Affirmative Action and Asia Pacific Policy and Planning Council. It tracks incidents of COVID-19 discrimination to develop policy interventions and long-term solutions to racism. Stop AAPI Hate has tracked 3,795 incidents from March 2020 to the end of February 2021, including verbal harassment, physical assault, and civil rights violations. We scheduled Dr. Jeung to speak before the targeted murders of Asian women in Atlanta. So this event is both very timely, and its coincidence with those targeted murders is deeply unfortunate. The events over the past year have caused many of us who teach in race and immigration to rethink our curricula, to make sure that we're giving sufficient time and space for students to appreciate the depth and breadth of Asian and Asian American experiences in the United States. We can draw a straight line from the Page Act of 1875, which banned the immigration of Chinese women, to the murders in Atlanta. Both the Page Act and the killer's own confession draw from the same fetishized notions of Asian women as sex objects. So to understand where we are today and where we can go moving forward, we first need to understand where we've been and how we got here. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Russell Jeung.
So as Professor Moorhead said, these are really dark times for Asian Americans. I'm still grieving and reeling from the Atlanta shootings. I've seen a lot of footage of Asian American grandparents being pushed and shoved. And so it's been a really difficult season. And just sort of seem to be reeling from death after death. Sadly, though, I am not surprised to see all this violence this year. Last year, when we created Stop API Hate, we got thousands of reports of how people were treating Asian Americans. And I saw firsthand how much hate and anger and fear was being directed towards Asians, so much so that it was palpable, as vitriolic. And so sadly, knowing how widespread that racism is, I wasn't surprised this year to see so much violence. And to give you a sense of what's happening nationwide, I'm going to invite, I forget who, Robert and Maria, to read some incidents. These are elderly. So keep in mind that these are Asian American senior citizens who are talking about their own personal experiences. And I invite you, as you hear it, to try to feel what it's like to be an Asian American grandparent at this moment. And feel free to put in the chat how you're experiencing what they're experiencing. So these are firsthand reports from Asian Americans, seniors.
The text is saying, a customer began screaming at me for no reason while in line and correctly distanced at over 6 feet. I'm mostly Chinese and my family's been in San Luis Obispo since 1860s, or 170 years. I'm 4th generation in San Luis Obispo. Guess I'll never be American.
Waiting to cross the street, I felt something on my head, and it turned out to be spit all over my hair and back of my coat. I was repeatedly spit on by a big white guy.
I was standing in an aisle at a hardware store when suddenly I was struck from behind. Video surveillance verifying the incident in which a white male using his bent elbow striking my upper back. Subsequent verbal attacks occurred with, "Shut up, you monkey. F you, Chinaman. Go back to China. bringing that Chinese virus over here.
On my daily walk in my hometown, Sausalito, wearing a face mask, a white woman yelled at me, "I hate Chinese people. Why do they come to this country?" when she passed me. I was stunned by her words and caused me to fear and be more alert of my surroundings.
My wife and I were taking a walk, minding our own business, when two dogs tried to attack us. When the woman owner came to us, she said, "The reason the dogs were afraid of you is because you eat dogs." Then I said, "You need to go back to where you came from." We were shocked to hear this.
Waiting to enter the pharmacy to get a prescription, a group of construction workers not doing social distancing made fun of the situation by mocking me, faking coughing, spitting, and made slant-eyed gestures till I told them to cut it out. No one else called this person out.
I was shopping and a child grabbed my arm. The child said I should go back to my country, and I was the reason his father died. The mother came up and put her hand on my arm. She didn't try to help me. Bakersfield occasionally has ignorant people who make fun of how I talk and look and tell me to go home. But this is the scariest and saddest experience I've had in the US since about 1977.
As I was leaving the restaurant, white males stormed up to me and verbally harassed and terrorized me, screaming, "Return to China, you effing Asian," and other hateful racial slurs, threatening me physically. This went on for several minutes as I departed the scene quickly to call police. A clear case of racial hatred towards me. I gave a verbal account to another officer who arrived later. I have not heard back from anyone.
Thanks. So if you can, please put in the chat how this makes you feel. So I see nauseated, shame, disgusted, ashamed, angry, fearful, upset, ashamed, angry, sad, scared, embarrassed, disgusted, sad and angry, angry, afraid, sad, fearful, angry, sad, disappointed, frustrated, disrespected, heartbroken, chilled, sad. So thanks. So you can understand how Asian Americans feel like we're in a state of siege at this moment, that these types of occurrences are so widespread that we are concerned and worried. And it's so much so that it has led to violence and death. And, because it's happened so often, for me, it's easy to become desensitized. And so I need to remember and to honor people and to remember people who've passed away are individuals with families. So I want to take a moment of silence and actually honor their memory by acknowledging people who've passed away this past year due to the violence. So if you could join me. I want to remember Pak Ho, a 75-year-old Chinese American who was robbed and killed last month. We commemorate Juanito Falcon, a 74-year-old Filipino American who was punched in the face and died 2 days later in Phoenix. We grieve for Visha Ratnapati, the 84-year-old Thai American who was body slammed and killed in January. We mourn for Christian Ha, the 19-year-old Chinese American shot 7 times and killed by police in Monroe County, Pennsylvania, just last year. We commemorate Angelo Quinto, the 30-year-old Filipino American who was killed by the police with a chokehold similar to George Floyd last Christmas. Remember those who were shot in Georgia. Their families wished to keep their names private. And we remember Dante Wright. Thank you for honoring their memories. So as Professor Moorhead said, we've received 3,800 incidents of hate last year through this year in February. And since then, since the Atlantic shootings, we've received thousands more. And the type of racism aren't just hate crimes, but they range. You can see here on the bottom part, 8% are civil rights violations. Asians are getting mistreated at the workplace. They're not getting ride shares. 7% are online incidents where you receive racist tweets or offensive posts. Microaggressions make up the bulk. Verbal harassment comprise 68% of the incidents, and being avoided or shunned make up 20%. But for me, I don't like the term microaggression. These are, as you've heard, terrible incidents where people get yelled at, have profanities and slurs slung at them. 1 out of 5 of our respondents, we just conducted a study, are now displaying signs of racial trauma. These are elevated symptoms of long-term depression, anxiety, hypervigilance, and avoidance. So these are the hallmarks of trauma, to be hypervigilant and avoidant. Finally, physical assault makes up the last category. We read time and time again in our incidents that people were coughing and spitting on Asians. My own wife was running on a trail and someone actually blocked her path and just coughed into her face. So we created a special coding category so people could just check off, someone spat on me. And again, we have hundreds of those types of incidents. I think people are weaponizing COVID-19 so that they think Asians are the source of the infection, so we want to reinfect them. And finally, physical assault make up 11% of the incidents. These could constitute hate crimes if racial bias was found. We're getting pushed and shoved, having bottles and rocks thrown at us. In a lot of cases, people try to run over Asians with cars. So again, we have all 50 states reporting, people from all ages. And what we notice, though, are that vulnerable populations are being attacked. Women are attacked twice as much as men, and youth and elderly are disproportionately impacted. So bullies seem to attack those whom they perceive as weak. And the question arises, this is just a biological virus that doesn't discriminate. Why is there so much targeting of Asian Americans at this moment? And there's 3 major factors as to why, in this current context, there's so much racism against Asian Americans. The first reason is the political rhetoric of last year. The term Chinese virus really was really damaging and actually really deadly, because what it did was it racialized the virus. It took a virus that's biological and made it Chinese, and it stigmatized the people so that Chinese people were the ones carrying the virus. So that association of Chinese people with a virus, again, was really deadly. People began to use the term. That term became viral hate speech, and that led to hate violence. It's deadly because people, when they make that association, when they see Asians, they automatically think about the virus. They have an implicit bias or an automatic assumption that Chinese people have the virus. When social media circulates the term and actually has representations like these, people then even further associate Chinese people with the virus and think that the virus is Chinese. So viral posts actually concretize or chemically hardwired in people's brains. This is psychology, the psychology of racism. People aren't necessarily intentionally being racist, but they are being triggered by race. And so they make the association that Asians are diseased. They feel threatened because the pandemic is scary, and they go into fight or flight mode. The fight mode is that they attack us, and the flight mode is they shun and avoid us. This is a picture of a coronavirus party at the University of Albany. So students were drinking Corona beer and partying with Chinese people with masks on all around them. Some of the pictures had Chinese people with their eyes X'd out as if they had died from the coronavirus. And this is how American students are partying. This post went viral. It's a picture of a Chinese person eating a bat, and that's the supposed origin of the disease. So again, with the terminology Chinese virus, it created that association, and people then automatically use that association when they perceive Asians. when people see another person in the US especially, the first things they notice are age, gender, and race. And whether it's conscious or not, we employ stereotypes to perceive them and then associate traits with these people. That's what's been happening. This all goes back to the yellow peril fear. The yellow peril is a stereotype that Asians would come from the East, dominate the West with their hordes of people and with their disease-ridden bodies. So there's this fear that Asian people would come, and as a result, because of that fear, people sought to exclude us and to avoid us. We've seen this yellow peril stereotype invoked time and time again throughout Asian American history. In the 19th century, these three diseases, malaria, smallpox, and leprosy, were seen to come and emanate out of Chinatown to be specters of death. So this fear, this yellow peril fear of disease, plus the idea that Chinese were stealing white worker jobs and the idea that Asians were unassimilable pagans, became the basis for the Chinese Exclusion Act, that the first piece of legislation that excluded a whole group of people. At the same time, anti-Chinese hate was so high that over 300 Chinese settlements in the West were displaced during the 19th century. These weren't individuals or individual lynchings. These were entire communities that were driven out by white mobs. My own family lived in Monterey, California by the aquarium for 4 decades until the landlord evicted them. When the Chinese wouldn't leave, a fire burned down the entire Chinese village, and the landlord then built a fence around so Chinese couldn't return. My great-grandparents then were displaced and had to move to San Francisco Chinatown as the only place for refuge from the racism. In 1900, the bubonic plague came, and it was found in Chinatown. So health officials cordoned off the area, segregated and quarantined the neighborhood. Whites were allowed to leave, but they kept Chinese in, presumably to get sick. In Santa Ana and Honolulu Chinatowns, health officials actually burned down the entire Chinatowns, leaving thousands homeless. So this newspaper article says that the plague has eerie parallels to modern day. We see history repeating itself. A disease comes from Asia, Asians are blamed for it, Asians face racist policies, and Asians face interpersonal violence. Disease was used to create racist policies throughout Asian American history. When we arrived at Angel Island, the immigration center, if you were found to be unhealthy, you were detained longer, and if you were medically unfit, you were deported. 10% of those making the journey were deported. Because of tuberculosis, Chinese and Latinos in California were often quarantined and actually faced family separation. So both sides of my family, both my father's siblings and my mom, faced family separation for years due to government regulations. So because of race and health policy, my own family has been excluded, quarantined, segregated, detained, deported, and separated from their families. That goes along with the whole idea that Asians are outsiders, yellow peril, threats to be kept out, to be excluded. We're foreigners. Even if my family's been here for 6 generations, we're still told, go back to China, you effing chink. And that's why this is how Asians are racialized. You know, last year when George Floyd was killed, Asian Americans faced a crisis of identity because we saw Total, the Hmong American, holding back the crowds. And because we're Asian Americans, we assume a group identity. We can't distance ourselves from other fellow Asians. And we saw an Asian American complicit with white supremacy hurting African Americans. And so Asian Americans had to wonder, are we complicit with whiteness, or are we really in solidarity with Black Lives Matter? Part of the whole push to immigrate is that Asians want whiteness. We don't necessarily want to be white, but we want the power of whites. We want the privilege of whites. We want the meritocratic privilege that to be treated as an individual like whites. So this whiteness leads us to be more anti-Black, at least in American society. That's the logic of immigration. But Asians are still in a quandary because we are neither white nor Black. We're often omitted in race relations discussions. And so Asian Americans have this identity issue. Where do we belong in America's racial hierarchy? What we finally realized last year is that we're racialized differently than African Americans. We're racialized as outsiders or insiders. Sometimes we belong to America. We're the model minority. We're crazy rich Asians. We're white adjacent. But in times of war, such as World War II, when Japanese were incarcerated, or after 9/11, when South Asians, Muslims, and Arab Americans faced Islamophobia, in times of economic distress, for example, Vincent Chin was killed when Japan's auto industry was outcompeting America, and he was killed by white auto workers who blamed him for being laid off. So in times of war or economic distress or pandemic, Asians are usually perceived as perpetual foreigners. This stereotype is much more operational now. It's much more widespread, and it's much more deadly to us. Being treated or being seen as a foreigner enables other Americans to objectify us, to treat us subhumanly, and to actually push and shove our elders. You could see this insider-outsider racialization in how Asian American women are represented in media. This is an intersectional objectification of Asian American women. Both their race and their gender impact them in negative ways. So when Asian American women are insiders to the US, they're often portrayed as China dolls. They're docile, they're submissive, they're appropriate for the white male gaze. But when they're seen as outsiders, then they're often portrayed as scary outside threats to be feared. So again, this is the primary ways that Asians have been portrayed in popular mainstream media. And in both cases, they're objectified, either as an insider or outsider. And that's why we think the Atlanta shooter, that's why he targeted and drove 30 miles out of his way to attack Asian businesses, and why he chose to shoot disproportionately Asian American women victims. So this racism has had severe impacts on our community beyond the violence. Right now, Asian Americans are the racial group with the worst mental health distress in the nation. And those who experience racism have higher rates of depression, stress, anxiety, and somatic symptoms. This is one of the key takeaway points. Again, we surveyed all our respondents, and we asked those who experience racism, what's your greatest stressor during the pandemic? What's your greatest fear? And overwhelmingly, our respondent says that racism is their greatest fear. Now think about that. Asian Americans say that other people's hate is more concerning than a pandemic that has killed over 500,000 people. Again, Asian Americans are more fearful of other Americans than they are of a pandemic that's killed 500,000 people. That's how pervasive this racism is. That's how traumatizing it is. That's how deadly it is. You know, we can protect ourselves against the COVID-19 by wearing a mask, but you can't really protect yourself from some random stranger who may come up to you and yell at you. And so again, Asian Americans, I feel, really are in a state of siege and trauma. Asian American businesses are also facing racism. People are avoiding Chinese businesses and Asian nail salons. As a result, our businesses closed down even before shelter-in-place quarantines. And a lot of Asians have lost their jobs because these businesses closed down. Asian Americans have the second highest rate of joblessness in the US. And finally, like I said, history repeats itself. We not only are facing interpersonal violence, but we're facing racist policies. Last year, the administration extended the Muslim ban to include more Asian countries. The administration cut migration visas so families couldn't reunite. He cut Chinese scientists and researchers from coming. He cut refugee resettlement, and the administration cut H-1B visas. All these policies excluded Asians, disproportionately impacted Asians, and aimed to treat us as outside threats to be kept out. So it's clear this racism is more than just a few hate crimes, but it's institutionalized. So history is repeating itself. Asians, a disease comes from Asia. Asians are blamed. Asians face interpersonal violence, and Asians face racist policies. But there's one other pattern that also repeats, and that's in all these cases, Asian Americans have resisted racism. They've always fought back. During the Chinese exclusion, thousands of court appeals were filed, a mass boycott against American goods was launched, and hundreds of thousands of Chinese Americans engaged in civil disobedience. They didn't register with the government as required. After World War II, Japanese Americans won redress and reparations. Today, Muslims, Arabs, South Asians are winning political office to address the Islamophobia they experienced after 9/11. And today, too, Asian Americans are rising up. Just to give you a few examples, we've had major youth campaigns in the Bay Area and San Francisco. In 2 different cities, 2 different middle schoolers held rallies that were citywide. I did a Stop API Hate, invited high school interns, and within a week, we got over 100 interns nationwide. They interviewed 1,000 Asian American youth, came up with their own policy report, and that policy report is the basis of Congresswoman Grace Meng's piece of legislation that she introduced a few weeks ago to include ethnic studies curriculum. I said that people are feeling threatened by Asians and they go into fight or flight mode. I think Asians too are experiencing this sense of fear and feeling triggered. So Asians too are going into fight or flight mode. The fight mode is that some Asians are arming themselves. Some Asians are telling their kids to bring mace. They want more policing. Other Asians are going into flight mode. They're telling their elderly not to go out. Asian Americans are the racial group least likely to send their kids back to the classroom for fear of the pandemic and racism on the way to school and racial bullying in the school. So we're going into fight or flight mode too, because we're under the state of siege. But there's a third response that I see the Asian American community doing that I think is really adaptive, and that's going into flock mode. Asian Americans are flocking together to protect themselves and to gain strength. We're flocking together, having these vigils to grieve and provide solace for each other. We're flocking back at rallies and to our communities to repatronize Asian businesses and to escort our seniors to and from places. We're flocking together to amplify our voice, so much so that President Biden has actually had to issue an executive order addressing the issue. We're getting corporate attention. We're getting mainstream news attention. So flocking together has been a real powerful response. You could see this in our social media. Initially, we weren't getting enough attention to the issue, and so Asian Americans have used alternative means, their own social media platforms, in order to get out the news that that Asian Americans are being attacked and it has to stop. So to conclude, I said Asian Americans now are facing an identity crisis, especially in relationship to Black Lives Matter. We wonder, where do we fit in America's white-Black divide? And as we face racialization as outsiders, we're seeing, wow, we really aren't accepted. People don't treat us humanly. We don't fit in. And so with this identity crisis, this is what I tell my students. You know what? I don't really want to belong to America the way it is. Though my family has been here, I'm 5th generation, I've never felt like I've really fit in, especially into white America. And I don't really want to belong because America is a society that stole indigenous land and stole the labor of Black bodies. America is a land of mass incarceration, of mass detention, of mass banning people, of mass shooting Asian Americans. So I don't really want to belong to that society. I don't want things to go back to normal because normal was racist. That's been our history. Instead, I think we could use this moment as a time to flock together and reimagine America. And Asian Americans, if you're an Asian American student, this is our opportunity to reimagine America to be a place where we want to belong to, where we disrupt that white-Black divide, where we don't have insiders and outsiders, where we honor our elderly and treat each other with respect. So my challenge to you, College of DuPage, is to flock with me. Thank you for already flocking with me tonight, and to reimagine and work towards an America that we all want to belong to.
Thank you, Dr. Jeung. That was an amazing talk. I took pages of notes. And so far, we've got 2 questions that have been put in the chat room. So anybody else, if you have questions, put them in the chat room so we can ask. The first one was, are there certain areas geographically that are experiencing this more? And this was about 5 or 10 minutes ago when you were talking. So I don't know if it was the Chinatown rallies, or maybe Julie can clarify what she meant by that. You can type it, Julie, or I'll find you. And why might it be happening in certain areas more than others?
Well, we're getting reports overall from, where Asian Americans live, mostly Illinois is like top 5, I think, and on the coast. So yeah, the racism occurs where Asian Americans are, but we also see it more violently in urban dense areas like New York or San Francisco. And that's because there's 2 trends. There's a racism last year fomented by the political rhetoric. And the second trend is that Asian Americans have always experienced violence if you live in a high crime neighborhood, right? And a lot of Asians are low income and live in high crime areas. So they've always experienced violence. I live in Oakland, and everybody in my neighborhood is a victim of violence. So, and then people conflate the 2, right? That everything's a hate crime. But really, we have to address the racism, and we have to provide more community safety for these high crime areas that have gotten worse during the pandemic because of economic distress, because of food insecurity, because of housing insecurity. I think that's led to the need for more mental health services. That's led to a lot of the violence you see. And they may not necessarily be racially biased or motivated like the racism.
Thank you. Yeah, and she meant just anti-hate for Asians in general. Robert asked a question that he had heard a stat that Filipino nurses are 4% of the registered nurses in the United States, but 30% of nurses who have died from coronavirus. Have you heard about that, or could you talk about that disparity?
Yeah, I think I've heard that disparity too. I don't know. It is really tragic. I think given how we've seen structural racism exposed this year, it's probably reasonable that Filipino American nurses and healthcare professionals are on the front line and exposed more, put into danger. And so I'm not surprised by that statistic. 20% of our respondents are essential workers. So yeah, given the high concentration of Asian Americans in the health field, it makes sense that it doesn't make sense, but it dispels the model minority stereotype. You would think these people who are highly educated and have high status would be treated better, but even Asian American doctors are getting shunned by their own patients, right? And so that just shows, even though you may have reached a certain kind of status in America, people will still treat you as a foreigner and mistreat you.
Are you able to feel any optimism for the future of this America?
Yeah, I think here's my optimism. I'm really angry and distressed to see elderly pushed and shoved. I'm really sad about a society that produces individuals that push and shove others. But again, what heartens me and encourages me is to see that flocking mechanism. And not only are Asian Americans flocking, but our allies are really flocking to support us. So I feel that and I see that. I think, again, most Americans want the elderly to be treated well. Most Americans want to accept others as humans, and most Americans respect each other. And here's the opportunity right now for Asian Americans. My concern is that hurt people hurt others, right? And abused people abuse others. And so people treated racistly, like Asian Americans, we can then act racistly too. And we can become anti-white, we can become anti-Black, unless we address the racism and get healed from the trauma we're experiencing. And so rather than, I think going into fight or flight mode, you don't really get healed. You just fight back and perpetuate the cycle of violence. And if you flee or you're frozen, you don't deal with the situation, right? And so what we need to do is really acknowledge our pain, share that pain, flock with others so that people understand and empathize with us. And then I think that's how you gain healing. So my hope is that healed people heal others, and that as Asian Americans can become racially healed, we can be positioned to be the healers of America, that we could, again, dismantle that insider-outsider binary, challenge the white-Black divide, and really seek a different way of being in America. So that's my hope, is that we would learn to be different.
Let's hope. We have a couple more questions. So one person asked, well, what can people like me, what can white people do to facilitate inclusion and actively denounce racism against Asian Americans, besides if we hear somebody yelling out something racist at an Asian American, calling that person out? What else can we do?
Well, actually, that's a lot. And even just asking you that question is really helpful, I think. So first of all, is to intervene, right? These thousands of cases, what made it worse is that oftentimes our respondents say there were other people witnessing and nobody stopped to help, right? And so that's even more devastating to see. People are treating me subhumanly and nobody cares, right? So intervene if you can and help the targeted individual, set boundaries with the perpetrator, like don't talk so racistly or step back, but don't engage with the perpetrator because that's just gives them more platform. But make sure they're safe. And again, because it's so traumatizing, sort of attend to our emotional state. Report these incidents. Because we've been able to gather thousands of cases, we've been able to document and have a greater voice. So the more we report, the more loud our collective voice is, and that's really helpful for us. And again, we take witness reports as well. This is what I recommend a lot of allies to do, is to really amplify your own voice in whatever institution you're in. So I don't know if College of DuPage has come out with an official statement or if the dean has, but it's really helpful to have official statements coming from the college president denouncing the racism, because it helps Asians feel seen and heard, right? That from the top, people actually acknowledge that they know what's happening and they're trying to guarantee our safety. That's really helpful, especially since we saw how words matter, how hate has been normalized. What we need are statements to normalize love and respect, sadly, but it does help to have statements. So whether you're in a faith-based institution or a union or a school, those official pronouncements are helpful. And I think allies could help us get those statements done. And well, there's two more recommendations: is go out and, again, shop and eat at Asian businesses. Just like for Black Lives Matter, there's a call to support African-American owned businesses, same thing here. And then, donate if you can to good causes. So, thanks.
Another question is, do you believe Asian Americans feel pressured to be racialized as outsiders or insiders due to society or forced racial identify? And then what are some interrupters that we can share in the classroom to address racism against Asian Americans? Yeah,
it's an interesting question. I mean, do we feel forced? I don't know if we're forced to, but this racism isn't an Asian American issue, right? This is a national issue of racism and violence. It's other people's problem. It's other people's issue about Asian Americans. So I don't think Asian Americans are forced to do anything. I don't think we're the victims. I think the other people are the victims of racism themselves because they're racist. And So yeah, again, we could feel like we're outsiders. We could try to belong and become insiders. But again, what I'm trying to promote is let's create a whole new society that we want to belong to.
Nice. So one of our students asked, well, should we still identify under like a race category? So for official forms and these institutional things. And then, if you select one, which one do you select and how does it affect you?
Yeah, that's your own choice. I think, so for me, I identify both as Asian American and as Chinese American. You can be both and, right? It's whoever you want to identify. Your identity is yours. You pick it and you choose it, and you make it your own. You live out, you embody those values that you think are important to you. So for me, being Asian American is a flocking power. So 60% of the respondents to Stop API Hate are not Chinese, even though China is being blamed. If you just happen to look East Asian, you could get attacked. So Koreans, Japanese, Vietnamese. A Latino person in LA was punched and shoved and told to go back to China. An indigenous person in Vancouver was pushed and shoved to go back to China. So, it depends on how you look. And so that racial, whether you identify with as Asian or not, that's how other people perceive you. And that's how they're racially profiling you. So you have to just be aware people are categorizing you and treating you as an Asian and then getting triggered because you're an Asian. So it makes sense for us to adopt that identity because as we flock together, we have a lot more power, right? Mm-hmm. At the same time, you also claim your individual distinctions, right? So we're Indian, we're Pakistani, we all have our religious differences, our language differences, our religious differences, and that's good too. So I think it's identify both ways, claim the power of being Asian American, and then also claim the uniqueness of your own ethnic identity.
All right, we have 3 more questions so far. So what can you recommend that schools and colleges should do to try to lessen hate towards Asians?
That's a great question. Well, if you could, include ethnic studies curriculum and teach the history, the roots of racism, I think that's the way to develop racial empathy. I mean, you can see how clearly divided our nation is. And that's why I think we need ethnic studies, is because people just sort of talk past each other. There's political divides, and all these other divisions, racial divisions. And so I think we need to learn how to talk to each other and come together. So classes are, that's what schools are supposed to do, is educate us. And so maybe we could learn how to be civilly discussing with each other. I know, again, my students are really facing a lot of severe mental health issues, pandemic plus the racism. So providing safe spaces where they can talk, where they can get professional services if necessary, that's really needed. And so like at San Francisco State, we've had like 3 or 4 forums now, and they're getting bigger and bigger. So even though it's online, we've had like 80 students come together at one session, and everyone's, because people are really scared. This cuts close to home. We're worried about our grandparents, right? We're not necessarily worried about ourselves. We're worried about our younger siblings and our grandparents. And it's harder because it's not your own life and you're concerned about others. So I think mental health is really needed at this moment. And then what we found actually reduces racism. One of the promising practices is having affinity groups work in coalition with other clubs. So if you had a multiracial, Black student union, Asian American grouping to discuss racism, that helps bring people together and fight a common issue.
Nice. Another of our students said that now that Biden is president, what has he done, or what do you think he'll do to stop Asian hate and racism overall? Because this student feels that racism is one of the biggest problems in society, and that they are sorry that you are experiencing this on a daily basis, and they stand with you.
Thanks. Thank you. Actually, it is really, reading these incidents every day is really painful. I'm still like, every time it's sort of re-traumatizing. So now I forgot the question.
They wanted to know, what do you think Biden might do to try to stop racism? Sorry.
I was frozen by my trauma. We've met with the White House, and because, again, this has gotten national attention, and he's issued an executive order that's taken a couple of our recommendations. But a lot of government officials say we have to have better hate crimes enforcement, but that's a sort of a Band-Aid solution at the end. We got to prevent racism before it occurs. And so again, we're pushing education, ethics studies. We're trying to push expanded civil rights protections. And so he agreed to all that, having a comprehensive government approach and encouraging the Department of Justice to reach out more and to educate people of their rights more. And also providing more victim services. So I think he's been responsive, and it is a marked contrast to what happened last year. You know, last year, the administration was joking about the Kung flu and mocking us and not even worried about the hate, whereas at least this administration has responded in an empathetic way. So we appreciate that, but we want more than words. We want long-term policies.
Mm-hmm. And the final question that I have, and you touched a bit on this before earlier, but what are some areas for improvements for AAPIs related to reaching out and coalescing with BIPOC groups?
Yeah, you know, a lot of times Asians play the oppression Olympics. And I think that's actually reasonable because race is a comparative construct. The only way you can understand your racial group is in comparison to other racial groups. So I actually think it makes sense. I can't help it but play the oppression Olympics. And but because we do that and we compare, a lot of times Asians say, we have nothing to complain about compared to that group, right? And so we tend to dismiss our own pain, dismiss what's happening now, perhaps. And I think what we need to do is actually know, at the moment, we need to center on our own grief and pain and trauma, because that's how, again, how we get healed. And that's how we actually gain empathy. If we're always being the model minority, people resent us. If we're not dealing with issues, then people don't know us. So I think by being vulnerable and sharing our own experiences, I think other groups would ally with us. Also, the more we understand how we're being treated as outside threats, the more then we can have empathy for others racially profiled as being threatening, those who are mass incarcerated, those who are mass detained, right? Those who are mass banned. So actually feeling the racism now helps us develop empathy with others who also experience racial profiling. So I think it's not great that we have that common humanity of oppression, but you know, it does connect us.
One question, but not necessarily a question. They want to thank you. This is a student. They said it was a great presentation, and that they also believe that bringing awareness and putting the light on these important topics is a way to minimize racism.
Well, thank you. Thanks to all the students who joined today. I really appreciate your time.
So I think we'll be wrapping up. The reading of those quotes from people was difficult. Not as difficult as people who actually lived the experience, obviously, but and then the moment of silence, it was a very moving. I wasn't quite ready for the emotions that it brought up. But I want to thank you, Russell, for your great presentation, and we'll continue the work here at the College of DuPage in trying to work towards addressing these issues. So thank you everyone for joining in. I think we peaked at around 95 people for the event tonight. So I appreciate people spending some time in their spring evening to sit through yet another Zoom presentation. So thank you everyone for the great questions from our students, and for students, faculty, staff, members of the community who've joined us here this evening. Thank you.